Dr. Hisham Nishwaki is here for actually, one of my questions was with Mr. Shadi, it's the same question. But before I ask a question this is United States of America. We promote freedom, democracy, and we have great value and principles. How come it took us 12 years so far and without finding a policy for a country and people rebelling against dictatorship and asking for freedom and democracy, while we in 24 hours we found this, we figured out our policy from Ukraine. We defending Ukrainian for same principles that Syria are struggling for. This is shame on leadership of this country. We're gonna be still on unjust of America to not come up with a policy after 13 years. I mean, I just wonder what's missing here in the Syrian case. We are the same people asking for the same demands. I can't find the answer. I'd love to hear from Mr. Jordan, as he's actually was a former Syria envoy, and I applaud what you did in the Congress testimony. You exposed President Biden administration giving a green light under the table to other countries. Thank you.
Thank you. So, hoping concerning Charles's point, so Charles and I are looking at the same events. I see a little more action. I agree with Charles. Overall, concerning the Middle East, it's a policy that was meant to be benign neglect. That was meant to be let's disengage. A policy of disengagement. However, at the same time, there were some damaging elements of engagement. So that I see as more active. For example, a Biden administration envoy worked very hard and is still working to try to encourage Syria's neighbors to do a gas pipeline deal that would involve Bashar al-Assad, and was assuring those regional neighbors of Syria that the Caesar Act was not going to be a hindrance, when the Caesar Act very clearly is a hindrance. It's explicitly a hindrance. That came long before now, and long before the earthquake, long before this normalization acceleration. It was exactly the wrong message to send. Secondly, I think the general license was another active measure that just very strongly reinforced the perceptions that had already been created by this pitching of the Arab gas pipeline deal. There have been other smaller elements like that, but they weren't lost on the Arab capitals. So I think the Arab capitals actually did see, to the extent that there is action from the administration, it's in the direction of relieving pressure on Assad. Also, as well, there's the drop-off in the enforcement of sanctions, whether they're Caesar sanctions or other sanctions on the Syrian regime, has been sharp, and it's been a very clear... I take that as an action as well. It's part of a policy of inaction, but it's an action. I mean, inside the... I don't want to get into competing administrations, but before this administration, there had been built an infrastructure inside the executive branch to enforce the Caesar Act and other Syria-related sanctions. It was dismantled at the beginning of the Biden administration. And let me circle around to reinforce Badr's point. The small group of 7 countries, 3 Arab capitals, 3 European capitals in the United States, by the end of 2020 had become a very tight policy coordination mechanism that kept all those capitals on the same sheet of music. It was discontinued in 2021. And I think there was a lot that was lost because that was a forum where the United States, the European capitals could head off at the pass, normalization outreach. And we did during, from 2018 to early 2021. Now, Gare Peterson's proposition in 2019 and 2020 was to try to grow the small group of 7 like-minded countries into a forum that could directly support the implementation of 2254 by bringing in the Russians, bringing in Turkey, bringing in the Iranians, bringing in whoever else needed to be brought in to that forum to have that be the main forum, essentially moderated by him on the implementation of 2254. We never got, under the Trump administration, to a full acceptance of that format because of the involvement of the Iranians. we were able to hold our noses and get, because we ourselves have it, we have engagement with the Russians on Syria from time to time. So that wasn't a problem. So I think honestly, my preference would be for that kind of forum now, which is an expanded contact group of the countries that really matter, that could make the implementation of 2254 a reality. I would much rather see that now than everyone going off in their own directions and doing piece by piece deals, as Badr mentioned. Okay, what can Congress? I'm belaboring these answers. Sorry, that's my MO. What can Congress do to stop a policy of inaction? There are two things. First is, just by strengthening the existing legislation, you have a chilling effect geopolitically, because you're signaling to the countries that would be acting, in violation of the Caesar Act or other U.S. legislation, that there is a congressional intent against that. And even if you have an executive branch now that is not that's not implementing those laws, you may soon. You could have a different executive branch at some point in the near future that would enforce those laws. So it has a chilling effect. Secondly, Congress can make some of these, Congress can remove or reduce the latitude of the executive branch in implementing some of these measures, as, for example, was done with the CATSA sanctions that wound up being aimed against Turkey for buying the S-300 air defense system from Russia. So you could get much closer to mandatory sanctions on some of these things. There are other authorities. There are other places where U.S. law is that way, and I think actually you're seeing a frustrated Congress is moving closer to that kind of approach. Why was there inaction on Syria, or a lack of decisive action on Syria versus a clear? One of the reasons is that I think people in Europe and here both said, "Look what's happening in Ukraine." One of the reasons the Russians have acted with impunity in Ukraine is because they got away with doing that in Syria. So I think a lesson has been drawn. I can't tell you the number of policy folks that I've talked to in Europe and here who said, "Well, this is what we get. We're not having stopped this kind of thing in Syria." Secondly, I think honestly, the most effective counter strategy to the Syrian revolution that Bashar al-Assad had was to take the steps that were needed to try to paint the revolution as an Islamist, a jihadist movement. And he did that himself, but it was extraordinarily effective to the detriment of the Syrian people, so that in the United States executive branch and in Europe and in the Arab capitals, the overwhelming concern in Syria became not a political solution, not the preservation of human rights, but counterterrorism. And the infrastructure that grew up in the national security apparatuses around the world to treat Syria first and foremost as a terrorism problem were vast. And it's very difficult to turn those policies around to say, hang on, let's actually address the root causes of terrorism. It's the Assad regime and its nature and its behavior. Very difficult. That was a battle that Ambassador Jeffrey and I and others fought inside the U.S. administration, and we didn't all the way succeed.